In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
I do want to dig down a little bit more on the Red Scare, because here we are again in the 21st century repeating. I guess we're in Red Scare number 3, because we had the first Red Scare after the First World War, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. People in the West got very nervous that, these communists might come overthrow our government. And so that's where it all began. You had the Palmer raids of 1920 and 21, where they rounded up and deported hundreds of Russians, just kicked them out of the country and sent them to Russia, suspecting that they might be communists, whether they were or whether they weren't. And then we did it again after World War II, which has always been both fascinating and puzzling to me, because we helped the Soviet Union defeat the Nazis in World War II. And before the war was even over, we had turned on our ally, the Soviet Union. You had Winston Churchill's Operation Unthinkable, this crazy idea he had to use repurposed Nazi soldiers fighting side by side with American and British soldiers. He planned to invade the Soviet Union again. It was going to be Operation Barbarossa Part 2. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and we did not actually do that. But that's when the Cold War really began. We did, in fact, recruit so many Nazis, Nazi scientists, Nazi spies, Nazi soldiers, and we brought them over to our shores here in North America. And it was immediate, almost immediate after the war, that this, I call it a brainwashing program, began, which later kind of turned into MK Ultra. All of this was the CIA. Mind control itself is Nazi science. It's old German science, MK, mind control with a K, because that's how the Germans would spell it. And so much of before they even started using drugs to brainwash our soldiers. I have a theory about that, Caleb, and I wanted to ask you your thoughts on it. The whole brainwashing affair during the Korean War, I believe, and now we know because we have a lot of declassified documents showing that that was in fact a military intelligence program, that we were brainwashing our men in the armed forces to hate the communists and kill the communists. And that had to be a hard sell, I would think, so soon after World War II, because that generation grew up believing that the commies were our friends. The Soviet Union was our friend. They grew up, getting all kinds of propaganda in the movies and the newspapers and from Washington that, Joe Stalin was Uncle Joe. And a whole generation of Americans, especially men of fighting age during the Korean War, still had fond feelings for Stalin. And they still looked at the Soviet Union as an ally. So it seems to me that MK Ultra was critical to changing their minds, even if they had to literally brainwash it into them to go kill the guys who were our friends just a few years ago. What do you think of that?
Well, in the last couple of years, MK Ultra has been a particular, topic of interest for me, and I've done some historical digging into it. And what I find to be the most amusing about it is that everything that was done seemed to be coming from like bad premises. If you read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks, you read The Poisoner in Chief by Stephen Kinzer.
Yeah.
The more you look into this stuff, really, the whole brainwashing MK Ultra scare in the United States started during the Korean War, when there were many Americans who got taken prisoner and in the prisoner of war camp confessed to crimes against the Korean people and announced they were communists.
Mhm.
And of course, I mean, American media was just, horrified. How could this happen? These are good Midwestern wholesome boys from Wisconsin and Iowa how could they have ever possibly done this, right? And so the CIA becomes convinced that this is some kind of like Chinese voodoo, right? There's a lot of racist movies, Fu Manchu, and they thought that the Chinese and the Koreans were doing some, they thought it was some kind of hypnosis or something, right? And that the racism really just comes across when you read it. They are convinced that this is like a magic spell or something, right? And so they start doing all kinds of research. And, Robert J. Lifton, he's a really big name in academia. He's the military psychiatrist they tap and they say, just go figure this out. And he spends years trying to figure out how this could possibly happen. And it never occurs to any of these people that maybe these guys did actually bomb innocent civilians and maybe feel bad about it. I mean, it's like, just saying, the Korean War, you're talking about 4 million people killed and all of that. And then the other thing that they discovered, which I think is probably the most important thing that came out of that, was that they discovered that the American GIs who did become communists were the most loyal, true believing, non-questioning GIs before. They were the guys who never thought America had done anything wrong, had a very black and white view of the world, that the communists were all bad and America was all good. So all they would do is they would isolate them from each other. They'd hold them separate, and then they would show them pictures of black people that had been lynched in America. They would show them images of, Emmett Till's mutilated body and, all the awful things that were going on, and say, this is what the American government, you say America's land of the free, it does this. And their first reaction would be, of course, that's a communist lie. America would never do that, whatever. But after a while, they show them pictures. They show them that the New York Times agrees with it. And then finally, they would just crack and realize that America does indeed do bad things, and they had never comprehended that. They'd had this black and white view of the world. And that if one has a very black and white view of the world, it's not that hard to flip the light switch, right? And that's what happened. And that the guys who were already a little bit, critical, that knew about some of the bad things of the United States, that had more of a shades of gray perspective, they didn't flip. But the guys they flipped were the ones that had a very blind, all or nothing view. And then once they cracked or whatever, then they would take them out of the cell by themselves. And then they would put them in with a bunch of other people who had already become communists. And they would reward the cell based on how well they learned the communist ideology. And after a while, these guys, just like they had kind of blindly accepted the American government line, they would then come out of the jail blindly accepting the Chinese communist line. And then during the Cultural Revolution, they all came back to the United States for the most part because they were not trusted. They were viewed with suspicion. And there was a number of American, GIs who, lived in China, for the 1950s. And then once the Cultural Revolution got going in the 60s, they came back to the United States because even though they might have been loyal communists, they were viewed with suspicion. And many people noticed that many of them, when they got back to the United States, just immediately shed their communist views. And once they were back in the United States, they're like, oh, yeah, I must have been wrong about that. And that I think that kind of what was discovered in all of that research is that for a lot of people, when it comes to politics and things like that, well, we know this, right? If you are in a little town where everyone's a Republican, you're pretty likely to be a Republican. If you're in a big city where everyone is a Democrat, you're pretty likely to be a Democrat. You go, if your workplace is full of Democrats and, your family are Democrats, you're likely to be a Democrat. If your university or your workplace or your community are Republicans, you're likely to be a Republican. And that those of us who do what you and I do, Lori, and think about this stuff with a huge amount of depth, we are a very, very small minority of people, right?
Unfortunately.
And that's kind of what that whole brainwashing, there's not much to it when it really gets down to it, is that people will conform to their environment, and that people that have a very black and white worldview are much more conforming to their environment. If they have a totally white view, if you put them in a black environment, they'll flip to take the black view. And if you take them out of it, they'll take the white view. But people that have a more shades of gray view are much harder to change. And that is what gave birth to the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, which was one of the most successful programs of the CIA, which was, instead of pushing hard anti-communism. It was subsidizing certain Marxists and promoting the Frankfurt School and other. That was a more effective way of defeating communism, they realized. And that, rather than demonizing the civil rights movement as a communist plot, they found various Black writers who were anti-communist, but also could talk about Jim Crow segregation and promoted them. And that was a much more effective way of defeating the communists. And that ultimately had a lot to do with the color revolutions and the Cold War, because those young people that were marching to bring down the Soviet Union, bring down East Germany, if you'd asked many of them, are you supporting capitalism? They would have said no. They would have said, we're for socialism with a human face. We just want human rights. And Gorbachev really did believe that Russia, if it gave up the Soviet Union, would be allowed to become a European welfare state like Norway or Sweden. And he was convinced that the people who wanted to destroy Russia, that was the Republicans, but the Democrats were sympathetic, and that there was a huge amount of manipulating left-wing politics and manipulating the political conversation to give people different impressions. And, the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't the result of just straight up anti-communism and military threat. You might hear that on Fox News. That's their version of events. It was really the result of a huge effort to infiltrate and confuse the Soviet Union politically, and to confuse the allies of the Soviet Union globally. So to the point that, that in, the constitutional crisis of 1993, barely any of the communists in the Western world supported Russia. It was, as 1993, the Soviet Union has fallen, the country's economically miserable, and the people of Russia voted for a government that would oppose austerity. The biggest party in that government was the Communist Party, but there was also some nationalist parties and others, and they were out in this, and they were elected. This was the elected government, the National Salvation Coalition, to kind of stop the destruction of Russia in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. And so then Boris Yeltsin, who was a good friend of Bill Clinton, he was the president, he dissolved the parliament. He declared a state of emergency and dissolved the parliament. And the parliamentarians refused to leave. And so the military started shelling the parliament, and people were in the streets, and hundreds of people died. And it was an awful event. And you would think,
I remember it well.
Yeah, you would think in such a situation, all the communists around the world would be rallying against Yeltsin and in support of the elected government in Russia.
They didn't.
And they didn't, because there was a huge amount of confusion and infiltration that had gone on, and that was a really important part of the Cold War. And that is, that's kind of what the Letter to Bob Avakian book is about, right? Is about how outlets like French intelligence and others have kind of weaseled their way into various communist spaces. And it's very, very confusing. Every communist government in the world supports Russia right now. Did you know this? Every single one. Yes. Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Belarus, they all support Russia. But yet among communist parties in Western countries especially, but even some of the other communist parties, it's not a majority. And why is there this big gap between what people who call themselves communists believe and do and what actual communist governments do? Well, that gap is the result of years of infiltration and manipulation and confusion. And it's funny because this is what a lot of the conservatives are also mad about. They're mad about the woke stuff and and all of that. Well, and it's government money from the American government that paid for all of this, because they wanted to create distance between the Soviet Union and American leftists. And there you go.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting to me that here we are in the third Red Scare. To me, there's no doubt that that's what's going on. All the propaganda is going in that direction. We're supposed to hate communism again. We're supposed to be afraid of China, afraid of North Korea, and all the, Russia fear-mongering, even though Russia is not a communist country anymore. Soviet Union's been gone for 30 years. There's still a hell of a lot of communists in Russia. And I think a lot of them continue to vote for Putin because they think he's a good leader, even though he is not a communist. And to this day, you see polls that show that, 75% of the Russian people think that Joseph Stalin was the greatest leader they ever had. Nearly 60% of Russians want the old Soviet Union back again, which I think is probably unlikely. But I believe that's why Russia is being targeted in this new Red Scare, is our government fears that they will return to the Soviet Union or they will return to communism. They see this alliance happening with BRICS and some of the other nations against the United States. And, it all comes down to this new form of mind control. Back in the 50s and 60s with MK Ultra, the scientists had to have physical access to the person in order to brainwash them, right? They gave them drugs. They would play certain films and tapes and, program them that way. But they had to have physical access to the individual. The rest they used propaganda for in the mass media to, films, Hollywood, television, anything they could to propagandize the public to hate communism and communists. So in the 21st century, it seems to me much more pernicious what they're doing because they no longer need physical access to the person. They no longer have to slip drugs to the person, right? They
Well,
use the internet.
I've got to say, those statistics you listed a little while back about, how popular Stalin is in Russia, how Soviet nostalgia is widespread. I get frustrated because I have had so many people say to me over the years when I tell them that I'm a communist, they say, "Oh, but haven't you ever talked to anyone who's lived under communism?"
Right. Yeah, I've been to Russia.
Pat myself on the head and I say, "Look at the polls. All the people, I mean, Romania, Czechoslovakia, they all say life was better. You don't know what you're talking about." But people feel like the Cuban who lives down the street from them, it represents, and the feelings of every person. And that is just, it's very frustrating, right? There is this assumption on the part of people that they know because they talked to people who fled to the United States. And it's like, we do hear a lot of exiles. The U.S. government, I believe, if you flee a communist government, you will
incentivize that.
Yeah, you get a visa automatically.
Yep.
And so, we get the anti-communists of the world come to the United States, but they're one side. And I always tell people that, if you went and interviewed Scarlett O'Hara about the U.S. Civil War, Captain Butler, I do declare, she would tell you one version of events about how Abraham Lincoln came down there and destroyed the South. It was horrible. Oh,
That's
my
right.
goodness, the slaves was all so happy before Lincoln showed up, and she wouldn't be lying. That would be her perspective.
That's right.
But there are two sides to every story. And we obviously can recognize that even though Scarlett O'Hara may have felt that way, that's not the whole experience of everyone of the Civil War. And when you talk to a Miami Cuban or you talk to somebody whose grandparents fled Ukraine in 1930, you're talking to one side of the story. And I urge people to think about that and actually realize that there are overwhelmingly done a huge amount of polls showing people in former communist countries saying that life was better before the fall of communism.
They do.
And so I find it frustrating when people arrogantly throw that out there, right?
I bet you do. And, that's one of the reasons that I enjoy having you on Strange Bedfellows, because here at Maverick News, we call ourselves the antivirus program for your mind. We are literally trying to undo decades of brainwashing of the American people and the Canadian people. We're talking 75 years of brainwashing ever since World War II, where we were told to hate all things communist and to immediately distrust it and never listen to the other side. And that's why I enjoy our dialogues, Caleb, because I think you bring a red pill, if you will, that a lot of people need to hear. Speaking of mind control, on one of your recent streams, you said something that really, really struck me, so much so that I had to write it down, and I wanted to ask you about it. You said, and I agree, because I think this is the new mind control, you said social media is the most sophisticated mind control mechanism ever invented, which scares the crap out of me because I think you're right.
Yeah, it is particularly pernicious. And you look at what social media has done. The ability to control what people think, to kind of put you in a bubble where you hear certain things, to channel information to you in certain ways. It's very scary. And social media is very, very good at inciting people against each other and managing people, managing the conversation. And if you're somebody who disagrees, managing your disagreement. It's very sophisticated in what it does. But ultimately, social media is all about atomization, right? It's all about separating you from other people so that the feedback you get and the information you receive and all of that is all channeled through the algorithms. And there's nothing remotely democratic about them. And that's
and the censorship.
Yeah.
It's not so much what you are allowed to see, but also the removal of things that they don't want you to see. And, as we were just talking about the way that YouTube took down 115 of your videos in a single day.
Yep.
And
Pretty
all
intense.
of them were reports for RT, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
And you know what's interesting, Caleb, was the timing of it, because it was centered around Zelensky's visit to North America, to the United States, and then to Canada. And we all see how that turned out. But they were trying their damnedest to censor any kind of pro-Russian content, Russian propaganda. They were taking down Scott Ritter videos. They took down videos with Faina that we've interviewed here on this program, and your videos, and several more.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.